I never thought the sound of someone else's quiet sorrow would shatter the meticulously built silence of my own gilded cage. My name is Sterling Hayes. For years, the only sounds echoing through the marble halls of my penthouse atop the Hayes Tower were the hushed footsteps of my executive assistant, the clinking of ice in my single malt scotch, or the low hum of financial news channels reporting on my latest acquisition. My world was a testament to engineered solitude, a fortress built of steel, glass, and a net worth that often felt more like a burden than a blessing. I was, by any measure, a king in my own domain, master of industries, an untouchable titan of finance. My mornings began not with a sunrise, but with a market report, my days filled with decisions that moved millions, my evenings with quiet contemplation, or more often, an empty, expansive quiet. It was a life I had carved out for myself after years of ruthless ambition, a life devoid of significant emotional attachments, deliberately sterile, yet undeniably efficient. That Tuesday, however, was different. I was in my private study, a room designed for strategic contemplation, its walls lined with first editions and a panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline that felt more like a backdrop than a living city. I was reviewing the quarterly projections for Hayes Global, a document thicker than a phone book, when I heard it. A soft, muffled sound, like a broken melody. It wasn't a cough nor a sigh, but something deeper, more raw. It was the sound of someone trying desperately not to cry, failing in the most human way possible. It came from the corridor just outside my closed, soundproof door. My initial reaction was annoyance, a prickle of irritation. My staff was trained in discretion, in invisibility. This was a breach of the carefully maintained quietude. I almost pressed the intercom to summon my head of security, a man named Henderson, who could make a whisper sound like a threat, to deal with the disturbance. But something held me back. Perhaps it was the sheer vulnerability of the sound, so out of place in my fortress of power. I rose from my ergonomic leather chair, a custom-made piece that cost more than some people's annual salaries, and moved silently to the door. I paused, my hand on the cool brass handle. The crying intensified slightly, a choked sob, followed by a shaky intake of breath. It sounded like a woman, a cleaning lady, most likely. They moved through the building like ghosts in the early hours, polishing the gleam off everything I owned, never seen, never heard. Their work was essential, yet they remained abstract figures, a necessary background hum. This wasn't a background hum. This was a tremor. I slowly, carefully, opened the door just a crack. My eyes scanned the pristine corridor, bathed in the soft glow of recessed lighting. There she was, a woman in a standard-issue grey jumpsuit, her back to me, hunched over a mop bucket. Her shoulders shook violently, and one hand was pressed to her mouth, as if to physically contain the eruption of grief. A stray strand of dark hair had escaped her bun, falling across her face. I could see the glint of tears on her cheeks as she leaned against the polished wall, her face buried in her arm. My first thought was a pragmatic one: liability. What if she was injured? What if she caused a scene? My second thought, however, was a jarring echo from a past I rarely acknowledged. It was the memory of my own mother, crying silently at the kitchen table late at night, her shoulders shaking just like that after my father's business went under, just before he started Hayes Global from scratch, clawing his way back. That memory, sharp and unwelcome, arrested my usual impulse to delegate. I found myself stepping out of the study, the soft click of the door announcing my presence. She flinched, startled, and spun around, her eyes wide and red-rimmed, full of shame and fear. Her name tag, pinned askew on her jumpsuit, read, "Maria." "Maria," I said, my voice perhaps a shade too sharp, unaccustomed to such direct, unplanned interaction. "Is everything all right?" The question sounded absurd even to my own ears. Clearly, nothing was all right. She stammered, trying to wipe away her tears with the back of her hand, smearing them further. Her uniform, usually immaculate, was rumpled, a stark contrast to the impeccable surroundings. "Mr. Hayes, I am so sorry, sir. I didn't realize. I just needed a moment." Her voice was rough, choked with emotion, a faint Spanish accent coloring her words. She looked like a deer caught in headlights, trapped between her professional duty and a deeply personal agony. My usual response would have been a curt dismissal, a reminder of the rules. Instead, I found myself studying her face, truly looking at her for the first time. There was exhaustion etched around her eyes, a weariness that went beyond physical labor. It was the kind of fatigue that gnaws at the soul. "A moment?" I repeated, my tone softening slightly, a rare occurrence. "It sounds like more than a moment. What's wrong?" I wasn't being kind, not exactly. More like an analyst dissecting a problem. My mind, trained to identify weaknesses and opportunities, was now fixated on this unexpected variable in my carefully controlled environment. Her gaze dropped to her worn work shoes, scuffed from countless hours of scrubbing and polishing. "It's nothing, Mr. Hayes. Just family matters. I will finish my work, sir, right away." She tried to regain her composure, straightening her shoulders, but a fresh wave of tears welled in her eyes, threatening to spill over again. She glanced nervously at the mop bucket, then back at me, as if expecting to be fired on the spot. I knew that look. It was the look of someone with everything to lose and very little to begin with. It was the look of desperation. I remembered my father telling me in those early lean years that desperation was the purest form of motivation. It could make a person achieve the impossible or break them entirely. Maria seemed dangerously close to the latter. I observed the tremor in her hands, the way she clutched the handle of the mop as if it were a lifeline. She was a woman, probably in her late 30s or early 40s, with a dignity that even her tears couldn't fully obscure. "Maria," I said, my voice firm but without anger, "tell me. It's clear something serious is happening. If you need time off, we can arrange it." I watched her closely, searching for the lie, the manipulation, the angle. My world was full of people trying to get something from me, but her raw grief felt genuine, uncalculated. She shook her head, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "I cannot, Mr. Hayes. I need this job. My son, he needs this job." The mention of her son tightened something in my chest, another echo of a forgotten responsibility. A memory surfaced, fleeting, of a time when my own parents struggled, when every penny counted, when the fear of losing a job was a palpable, suffocating presence. It was a distant, almost alien concept now, cushioned as I was by billions. But seeing it in her eyes, feeling the reverberation of that long-ago fear, was disconcerting. It was Virada 1, the moral problem, an injustice had appeared. Not in some distant stock market manipulation, but right here in my own hallway, in the tears of a cleaning lady. And I, the king of my domain, felt a flicker of something unsettling. Responsibility, perhaps, or simply a deep-seated, unsettling curiosity that I couldn't ignore. My carefully constructed detachment was starting to fray around the edges. I cleared my throat, the sound a little rougher than usual. "Your son? Is he ill?" I pressed, surprised by my own persistence. I usually paid people to gather such information for me. She hesitated, then nodded, her gaze still fixed on her shoes. "Yes, sir. He has a rare condition, needs a very expensive surgery. Insurance won't cover it all. And my mother, she just lost her pension. My sister's husband lost his job. It's all too much." Her voice cracked again, and this time she didn't try to hold back the sobs. She openly wept, her shoulders shaking with the full force of her anguish. The sound was unbearable in its raw honesty, a counterpoint to the sterile perfection of my world. It wasn't just about her son then. It was a cascade of misfortunes, a perfect storm that had landed on her doorstep, threatening to drown her. This was the true rupture of my normal, This was not a minor inconvenience. This was a human being breaking down, utterly exposed, right outside my door. My instinct, honed over decades of corporate warfare, was to analyze, to strategize. But the situation demanded something different, something I was less accustomed to providing, genuine human consideration. I knew I couldn't simply walk away. The sound of her despair had pierced through the layers of my carefully cultivated indifference, leaving an uncomfortable, raw wound. The silence of my mansion no longer felt like peace. It felt like a judgment. My mind began to race, not with market fluctuations or acquisition targets, but with Maria's words: rare condition, expensive surgery, insurance won't cover it all. These weren't abstract figures from a charity report. These were specific personal details, painting a vivid picture of a life teetering on the edge. I stood there, an uncomfortably long moment, listening to her muffled cries, feeling the weight of her helplessness. My wealth, usually a source of immense power and security, suddenly felt irrelevant, almost obscene, in the face of such raw, unvarnished human suffering. I owned private jets, sprawling estates in the Hamptons, a collection of vintage sports cars that could fund a small country. Yet here was a woman in my employ, whose entire world was crumbling over medical bills. The contrast was stark, almost violently so. My world of privilege, isolated and immaculate, was suddenly confronted with the harsh, unforgiving realities that existed just beyond its gilded gates. My initial annoyance had completely evaporated, replaced by a strange mix of discomfort and a burgeoning, unfamiliar sense of obligation. What was I supposed to do? I, Sterling Hayes, didn't deal with personal tragedies. I dealt with markets, with corporations, with abstract numbers. Yet her tears, the sound of them, had bypassed all my usual defenses, landing squarely in a place I rarely acknowledged. It was a profound and unsettling experience, forcing me to confront the stark realities of a world I had largely chosen to ignore. The air in the corridor felt heavy, charged with unspoken desperation, and I found myself, for the first time in a very long time, feeling utterly out of my depth. "Maria," I said, my voice softer now, almost a murmur. "Go home." She looked up, startled, her eyes still brimming. "Sir, go home," I repeated more firmly. "Take the day off. Your work can wait. I'll ensure you still get paid for today." She looked at me, a flicker of disbelief in her watery eyes, as if expecting a trap. "But the floors, sir, the office." "The floors can wait," I reiterated, waving a dismissive hand. "Your son cannot. Go, get some rest. We'll talk tomorrow morning." It was a gesture, a small reprieve, an attempt to temporarily stop the flood. It felt meager, almost insulting, considering the magnitude of her crisis. But it was all I could offer at that exact moment. She nodded slowly, still tearful, but a hint of gratitude replaced the fear in her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. Thank you so much." She bowed her head slightly, then slowly, almost reverently, pushed her mop bucket away, gathered her cleaning supplies and moved down the corridor, disappearing around the corner. The silence returned to my penthouse, but it was no longer the same. It was a silence now imbued with the echoes of her tears, a silence that felt heavy, pregnant with unspoken questions and an unexpected, inconvenient moral obligation. I had opened a door, not just to my study, but to a part of the world I had assiduously kept at bay. And now I had to decide what I was going to do about it. The day had barely begun, and my meticulously planned routine had already been irrevocably disrupted. I returned to my study, but the quarterly projections suddenly seemed trivial, meaningless. I closed the door to my study, but the silence that usually soothed my analytical mind now felt hollow, punctuated by the lingering memory of Maria's raw grief. The quarterly projections lay untouched on my desk. My focus had shifted irrevocably. I, Sterling Hayes, known for my ruthless efficiency, found myself caught in the eddy of someone else's personal tragedy. It wasn't just the crying. It was the story behind it, the cascade of unfortunate events that had brought Maria to her knees in my pristine hallway. A sick child, a lost pension, a husband out of work. It sounded like a bad script, but I knew intuitively it was all too real. My initial thought was to simply write a check, a substantial one, enough to cover the surgery and alleviate her immediate financial burdens. It was my usual modus operandi for dealing with uncomfortable situations, throw money at it until it disappeared. But something about Maria's eyes, the profound, almost desperate dignity in them, made me pause. It wasn't just money she needed. It was an acknowledgement of her humanity, perhaps even a recognition of a systemic failure that had pushed her to this brink. A check would be a transactional act, sterile and impersonal. This situation, I realized, demanded more. I picked up the phone and dialed Henderson, my head of security. "Henderson," I stated, my voice devoid of emotion, "I need you to look into one of our cleaning staff. Maria, last name unknown at the moment. Find out everything. Her family situation, her son's medical condition, the hospital, the insurance details, everything. And do it discreetly. No one should know I'm involved." Henderson, a former Marine, was the epitome of efficiency. He didn't ask questions, he executed. "Consider it done, Mr. Hayes. How soon do you need this?" "Yesterday, Henderson, yesterday." I hung up, a strange sense of purpose stirring within me. It wasn't charity, it was research. That's what I told myself. But deep down, I knew it was more. It was a morbid curiosity, a desire to understand the mechanics of such profound misfortune, perhaps to distance myself from it, or perhaps to find a way to make it right. I spent the next few hours in a state of agitated waiting, something utterly foreign to my nature. I usually dictated the pace of events, not reacted to them. My mind, usually a fortress of logical deduction, kept replaying Maria's tear-streaked face, her hushed apologies, her desperate plea for her son. It was a micro-trigger, a recurring flashback that wouldn't let me focus on the stock tickers flashing across my wall-mounted screens. I remembered a similar look in my mother's eyes when she had to sell her antique jewelry to keep our family afloat after my father's first venture collapsed. The shame, the silent agony, it was universal, cutting across all socio-economic strata. The memory was sharp, a shard of glass from a past I had meticulously buried under layers of success and affluence. Around noon, Henderson's call came. His voice was calm, clinical, relaying the stark facts of Maria Rodriguez's life. Her son, Mateo, was 11 years old, suffering from a rare congenital heart defect. He needed a complex, expensive surgery within the next 3 weeks, or his condition would become irreversible. The cost was astronomical, nearly $250,000. Their insurance, a basic plan provided by the cleaning company, covered only a fraction. Her husband, Carlos, had been laid off from his construction job 3 months ago when a major development project went belly up. A project, Henderson added, with a slight pause, that Hayes Global had pulled out of at the last minute, causing a ripple effect throughout the local construction industry. My company's action, a purely financial decision, had indirectly contributed to Carlos's unemployment. A knot tightened in my stomach. Furthermore, Maria's elderly mother, Elena, had recently lost her modest pension due to a shady investment scheme, leaving her dependent on Maria. And her sister Sophia was also struggling, her husband out of work, making Maria the sole strained breadwinner for an extended family. It was a perfect storm of economic misfortune, a bleak tableau of the American dream gone awry. Every detail Henderson relayed was like another brick in a wall of guilt I hadn't realized I was building. My company's decision, so detached and strategic from my penthouse, had a very real, very human cost on the ground. This was the true nature of Virada 2. I had believed I could solve it with a simple check, a false exit, but the problem was deeper, more tangled, and now my own indirect involvement was undeniable. I was not just an observer, I was, in a small but significant way, a participant in her misfortune. The comfortable distance between my billions and her struggle had just collapsed. "Anything else, Henderson?" I asked, my voice betraying none of the turmoil churning within me. "Just one more thing, Mr. Hayes. Maria's apartment building, it's in the East Harlem area. The landlord has been raising rents aggressively. She's behind 2 months now." He paused. "It's owned by Sterling Properties, sir, one of your subsidiary holding companies." The information hit me like a gut punch. My own company, through a labyrinthine structure of subsidiaries and shell corporations, was Maria's landlord. I was, in essence, profiting from her struggle, even as she cleaned my floors. The irony was brutal, suffocating. I felt a surge of cold anger, directed not at Henderson but at myself, at the intricate, impersonal web of my own empire. How many other Marias were out there, unknowingly tethered to my vast, uncaring network? This wasn't just injustice, it was complicity. I thanked Henderson, my tone curt, and disconnected the call. I paced my study, the plush Persian rug feeling like sandpaper beneath my feet. This was precisely the kind of entanglement I had always avoided. I had built my empire to be impervious, untouchable, yet here it was, reaching out and pulling me into a messy human drama. I was not just the billionaire who might help. I was the silent, unwitting oppressor. The question that gnawed at me was not if I should help, but how, and more importantly, why. Was it genuine compassion, or a desperate attempt to assuage a rapidly burgeoning guilt? My eyes fell on a framed photograph on my desk, an old sepia-toned picture of my parents and me, a much younger version of myself, standing outside a small, unassuming storefront. "Hayes Electronics," the sign read. That was before the empire. Before the billions, before the detachment. It was a time when my father knew the names of all his employees, when their struggles were his struggles. I remembered him giving a substantial loan to one of his repairmen whose wife needed emergency surgery. No questions asked, no interest charged. He had simply said, "We're all in this together, son." I had scoffed at such idealism even then, dismissing it as naive sentimentality. Now, looking at Maria's situation, I wondered if I had lost something vital in my relentless pursuit of success. I slumped back into my chair, the vast expanse of my office suddenly feeling like a prison. The luxury around me, the expensive art, the breathtaking view, it all felt hollow, suffocating. I had built a kingdom, but at what cost? Was it worth the spiritual desolation that came with such absolute power and isolation? My thoughts circled back to Maria, to her silent tears, to the precariousness of her existence. And you, would you have been as blind, standing there in your comfortable life, thinking a few bucks could mend a broken soul? The question hung in the air, piercing my carefully constructed facade of indifference. It wasn't just rhetorical. It was a challenge, a moral gauntlet thrown down at my feet. The answer, I knew, was a resounding, uncomfortable yes. I had been blind, and now, seeing, I was faced with a truth far more complex than a simple financial transaction. The next morning, Maria was back, her face still etched with fatigue, but with a renewed, almost fierce determination. She moved through the corridors with a silent grace, as if yesterday's tears had never happened. I watched her from my study, a ghost in my own home, a voyeur to her quiet resilience. I had spent the night wrestling with my conscience, or what little remained of it. Henderson's report had painted a stark picture, and the revelation about Sterling Properties owning her building had twisted the knife in my gut. I wasn't just a bystander. I was part of the problem. When she finally approached my study, mop in hand, I opened the door. Her eyes widened slightly, expecting a reprimand, I assumed. "Good morning, Maria," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "May I speak with you for a moment?" She nodded, her grip tightening on the mop handle. I gestured for her to follow me into the study, a space she had only ever cleaned, never occupied as a guest. She hesitated, her discomfort palpable, but then stepped inside, her eyes cautiously scanning the opulent room. I gestured towards the leather armchair opposite my desk. "Please sit." She looked at the chair, then at me, then back at the chair, as if it were a booby trap. "Oh no, Mr. Hayes, I couldn't. I'll just stand." "Sit, Maria," I insisted, a touch of steel in my voice. She finally, reluctantly, perched on the edge of the chair, her back ramrod straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I sat behind my desk, the massive mahogany barrier between us emphasizing our disparate worlds. "I asked my team to look into your situation," I began, cutting straight to the chase. Her eyes darted to mine, a flicker of surprise and alarm. "Mr. Hayes, I don't know what to say. I never meant to cause trouble." "You didn't cause trouble, Maria," I interrupted, leaning forward. "Your life simply became entangled with mine in an unfortunate way. Henderson reported that your son, Matteo, needs a heart operation, costing close to $250,000, and your family is facing severe financial difficulties, partly due to some ripple effects from one of my company's decisions." Her face went pale. The truth, blunt and unadorned, was clearly overwhelming her. I don't understand, Mr. Hayes." "It means," I continued, "that I have decided to help. I will cover the full cost of Matteo's surgery, and I will ensure he receives the best medical care available. Beyond that, I will also provide a substantial sum to alleviate your family's immediate financial burdens, your mother's situation, your sister's husband's job loss, for a year, to give you all a chance to get back on your feet." I watched her face, expecting an outpouring of gratitude, tears of relief, anything. Instead, a complex mix of emotions crossed her features, disbelief certainly, but also a flash of something akin to suspicion, and then, surprisingly, a hardening around her mouth. "Why, Mr. Hayes?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper but firm. "Why are you doing this?" Her question, so direct and devoid of expected effusiveness, caught me off guard. Most people in her position would have been effusively grateful. She was challenging me. "Because," I said, choosing my words carefully, "my company, Sterling Properties, is your landlord, Maria, and my company, Hayes Global, made a decision that impacted your husband's employment. I have, however, indirectly contributed to your distress. I cannot stand by and ignore that. It was a partial truth, an attempt to rationalize my actions with a veneer of corporate responsibility, rather than acknowledging the deeper, more unsettling stirrings within me. It was Virada 3. The truth had come to light, revealing my culpability, inverting the roles. She was no longer just the unfortunate cleaning lady. She was, in a sense, a victim of my empire, and I, the supposed benevolent billionaire, was now the one bearing the weight of an uncomfortable moral debt. She looked at me, her gaze piercing, unwavering. "So, this is charity or compensation?" Her question was a mirror, reflecting my own internal conflict back at me. "It's an attempt to rectify a wrong," I answered, perhaps a little too defensively. "A wrong that I inadvertently played a part in." She considered this for a long moment, her brow furrowed. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice gaining strength, "my family, we are proud people. We work hard. We don't ask for handouts. We just want a fair chance." "This isn't a handout, Maria," I said, a rare note of exasperation in my voice. "This is an investment in a future that should have been yours anyway. Your son deserves a healthy life." I knew my words sounded hollow, calculated. I was still struggling to articulate the profound shift that had occurred within me since hearing her cries. It wasn't just about rectifying a wrong. It was about something more, something that gnawed at the edges of my self-imposed isolation. I leaned back, my gaze drifting to the city sprawling beneath us. "Look, Maria," I continued, "I live in a world where numbers define everything. But sometimes those numbers have faces. You've made me see one of those faces. Let me help." She looked down at her hands, then back at me. "My son is a good boy, Mr. Hayes. He is brave. He does not complain." "I'm sure he is," I replied. and he deserves a fighting chance. So what do you say?" She closed her eyes for a moment, a single tear escaping, not of sorrow but perhaps of sheer relief, or perhaps of resignation to this strange, unexpected turn of events. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," she finally said, her voice thick with emotion. "For Matteo. Thank you." Her gratitude felt different now, earned, not merely given. It was not a capitulation, it was an acceptance of help for her son on her own terms. The tension in the room, however, did not dissipate entirely. I had offered a solution, but the deeper moral complexities remained, simmering beneath the surface. This wasn't the end of the story. It was merely the beginning of my true reckoning. The next 24 hours were a whirlwind, orchestrated by me with the precision of a hostile takeover. I contacted the best pediatric cardiologists in the nation, making calls that pulled strings and opened doors that usually remained impenetrable. Matteo's case was fast-tracked. A team of specialists at New York Presbyterian Hospital, renowned for their cutting-edge cardiac procedures, was assembled. I instructed my legal team to set up a discreet trust fund for Matteo's medical expenses, ensuring that Maria and her family would not have to navigate the labyrinthine world of insurance claims and medical bills. The cost, as Henderson had estimated, was indeed substantial, but to me it was a rounding error, a fraction of my fortune. Yet it felt like the most significant transaction I had made in years. I also had my team work on finding a suitable, less expensive apartment for Maria's family, one not owned by Sterling Properties, but still in a safe, accessible neighborhood. Furthermore, I leveraged my network to find Carlos, her husband, a steady job with a reputable construction company, ensuring a stable income for the family. For Maria's mother, Elena, I arranged for a financial advisor to help her recover what she could from the lost pension and set up a small, secure annuity. These actions, carried out with my usual detached efficiency, were supposed to bring me a sense of satisfaction, of having fixed the problem. But the deeper I delved into their lives, the more I realized that this was not a problem to be fixed, but a human tragedy to be addressed, and my involvement was far from merely transactional. Maria, though overwhelmed by the rapid changes, maintained a quiet strength. She still came to work, insisting on fulfilling her duties until Matteo's surgery date. She met with the doctors I recommended, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. She thanked me repeatedly, her gratitude genuine, but she never fawned or made demands. This unexpected dignity continued to chip away at my hardened exterior. It made me question the nature of my own wealth, the almost casual ease with which I could alter lives, both for better and for worse. One evening, after the arrangements for Matteo's surgery were finalized and his admission date set, I found myself alone in my study, the city lights twinkling outside like a million indifferent stars. My phone buzzed, a text message from an old rival gloating about a minor market victory. Normally, I would have responded with a sharp, cutting retort. Tonight, I simply stared at the message, then deleted it. The game, the endless pursuit of more, suddenly felt empty. The thrill was gone. My focus, instead, was on a small, grainy photograph Henderson had included in his initial report. A picture of Matteo, a slender boy with wide, intelligent eyes, a faint scar visible near his left ear. He was smiling faintly, holding a worn soccer ball. He looked fragile, yet full of life. It was a stark reminder of the fragile thread upon which human existence often hung, a thread that I, with my billions, could either cut or reinforce. This was Virada 4, the profound emotional and moral discovery. I realized my own flaw was not just in my indirect culpability, but in my prolonged detachment, my active ignorance of the lives affected by my empire. My wealth had shielded me, yes, but it had also blinded me, creating a moral vacuum around me. I walked over to the window, gazing out at the sprawling metropolis. How many other stories like Maria's were unfolding in those endless rows of windows, in those bustling streets? How many lives had been subtly, irrevocably altered by decisions made in boardrooms like mine, by men like me? The thought was unsettling, heavy. I had built a legacy of power and profit, but was it a legacy of good? The question echoed in the cavernous expanse of my conscience. I had always prided myself on my rationality, my ability to separate emotion from business. But Maria's tears, Matteo's fragile smile, had bypassed all logic, striking at something deeper, something dormant within me. My meticulously constructed self-image as a benevolent titan, or even a morally neutral one, was crumbling. The following day, Matteo underwent his surgery. It was a long, agonizing day. I received updates from the hospital hourly, my usual work schedule entirely abandoned. Maria was there, of course, with Carlos and Eleanor, waiting in the sterile silence of the waiting room. I contemplated going, offering support, but I knew my presence would only add another layer of awkwardness. I chose to wait it out in my penthouse, feeling utterly useless, a stark contrast to my usual sense of omnipotence. Finally, late in the evening, the call came. The surgery was a success. Matteo was in recovery, stable. The relief that washed over me was profound, unexpected and utterly personal. It wasn't the relief of closing a successful deal or averting a corporate crisis. It was the raw, unadulterated joy of knowing a child had been given a second chance at life. That night, for the first time in years, I slept soundly, a sleep untroubled by the usual anxieties of the market or the complexities of my empire. When I woke, the city outside my window seemed to glow with a different light. The silence of my mansion, once a comfort, now felt like an absence, a space waiting to be filled. I realized then that my actions with Maria and Matteo were not just about them. They were about me. They were about reclaiming a piece of myself that I had sacrificed on the altar of ambition. They were about discovering a new purpose beyond the accumulation of wealth. I knew this was just the beginning. I had opened one door and now I saw countless others. The hidden theme, the solitude behind success, was laid bare for me. My billions had bought me isolation, but Maria's quiet suffering had offered a path back to humanity. I had helped her, yes, but she, in her vulnerability, had helped me more. Could you look in the mirror, knowing your privilege shielded you from the very pain you caused, and still choose to do nothing? The answer was no. Not anymore. Not after Maria. Not after Matteo. My wealth had become a mirror, reflecting not just my power, but my responsibility, and the reflection I saw was changing, slowly, irrevocably. The gilded cage, once a fortress, now felt like a lonely, lonely place. The journey of transformation, I quickly learned, was far more arduous than the simple act of writing a check or pulling strings. Matteo's recovery was slow, delicate, requiring weeks of hospital care and months of rehabilitation. I continued to receive daily updates, my involvement remaining discreet but unwavering. Maria, through her continued presence at my penthouse for her cleaning duties, became an anchor, a living reminder of the stark contrast between my world and hers, and the bridge I was attempting to build between them. She saw me less as a distant, intimidating figure and more as a complex, perhaps even conflicted, human being. Our conversations grew longer, less formal. She would tell me about Matteo's small victories, his struggles, her hopes for his future. I, in turn, found myself sharing glimpses of my own life, albeit carefully curated ones, an exchange that would have been unthinkable weeks prior. My interactions with Maria began to peel back layers of my carefully constructed persona. I started to see the world differently, through her eyes, through the lens of those for whom basic security was a daily struggle, not a given. The sheer resilience of her spirit, the unwavering hope she held for her son, despite the crushing weight of her circumstances, was both humbling and inspiring. It ignited in me a spark of something I hadn't felt in decades, genuine empathy, a desire to effect change, not just for strategic gain, but for the inherent good of it. This burgeoning awareness led to a deeper, more systemic introspection. I'd ordered a comprehensive audit of all my subsidiary holding companies, particularly Sterling Properties. What I uncovered was a labyrinthine network of acquisitions and investments designed for maximum profitability and minimal public accountability. Many of these properties, like Maria's apartment building, were in low-income neighborhoods where rents were systematically raised, often pushing families to the brink. My wealth, I realized with a sickening lurch, had been built in part on the quiet suffering of countless others. This was my personal Virada 5, the ambiguous conclusion where justice was being done, but with a profound emotional loss for myself. I was confronting the true cost of my empire, the moral compromises embedded within its very foundation. One afternoon, I found an old, faded newspaper clipping tucked away in a forgotten desk drawer. It was from a local paper, dating back almost 20 years. The headline read, "Small businesses suffer after major developer pulls out." The article detailed the devastating ripple effect when a large corporation, then just starting its ascent, abruptly withdrew from a planned urban development project, leaving local contractors and small businesses in the lurch. My father's company, Hayes Global, was mentioned. It wasn't a direct admission of wrongdoing, but the context was clear. Our early growth had at times come at the expense of smaller entities and communities. I remembered my father brushing off the criticism at the time, arguing that business is business. I had absorbed that lesson too well. This news clipping, a forgotten fragment of the past, now felt like a mirror, reflecting the same pattern of detached, consequence-free decision-making that had led to Maria's husband losing his job. It underscored the systemic nature of the problem, and my family's long-standing, often unwitting role in it. The internal conflict became a roaring fire within me. On one hand, there was the Sterling Hayes of old, the ruthless, pragmatic billionaire whose primary allegiance was to profit and power. This persona whispered that I had done enough for Maria, that I had assuaged my guilt, and now it was time to return to my real work. On the other hand, there was a nascent conscience, awakened by Maria's tears, Matteo's innocent face, and the unsettling revelations about my own empire. This new consciousness demanded more. It demanded systemic change, a rectification not just for one family, but for the many. I envisioned a future where my immense resources could be a force for genuine good, not just a shield against personal responsibility. But this meant dismantling parts of my empire, restructuring my investments, sacrificing profitability for principles. It meant public scrutiny, potential backlash from shareholders, and a radical departure from everything I had ever known. It was a choice between power and conscience, between maintaining my pride as an untouchable titan and embracing a new, vulnerable role as a responsible human being. This was the true climax, the moment I felt myself shattering emotionally. The decision was not easy, it wasn't logical, it was gut-wrenchingly emotional. I spent an entire weekend locked in my study, ignoring calls from my board members, from my mistress, from everyone. I reviewed countless documents, not for profit projections, but for ethical implications. I revisited the stories Henderson had unearthed, not just Maria's, but others, stories of families displaced, small businesses crushed, lives irrevocably altered by the invisible hand of my corporation. The weight of it all was suffocating. I felt the profound loneliness of my position, the isolating burden of immense power, and the terrifying prospect of dismantling a legacy I had spent a lifetime building. My choice, when it finally solidified, was a quiet, internal earthquake. It wasn't a grand public announcement, not yet. It was a decision to fundamentally alter the trajectory of Hayes Global, to integrate social responsibility not as a performative gesture, but as a core principle. This meant divestment from exploitative properties, reinvestment in community development, and establishing robust ethical guidelines for all future ventures. It meant creating a foundation dedicated to providing affordable healthcare and housing, starting with the very communities my empire had inadvertently harmed. It meant, in essence, sacrificing a significant portion of my potential future profits, perhaps even diluting my personal fortune to build something more meaningful. This seismic shift, I knew, would come with a heavy cost. Shareholders would revolt. Analysts would call me mad. My carefully cultivated image as a ruthless, infallible businessman would be shattered. But the alternative, a return to the sterile, detached world of unchecked ambition, now felt like a far greater punishment. The thought of that cold, empty silence, knowing what I now knew, was unbearable. It was a choice born not of logic, but of a profound, almost spiritual yearning for redemption. The gilded cage now felt less like a sanctuary and more like a prison constructed of my own indifference. I had found my conscience, and it was demanding its due. The true meaning of my billions, I realized, was not in what they could buy, but in what they could undo. The following week, Maria approached me, her cleaning cart humming softly beside her. Matteo was recovering well, already home, albeit still weak. His laughter, she told me, was slowly returning to their small apartment. Her gratitude was boundless, palpable. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice soft, "you have changed everything for my family. We will never forget your kindness." I looked at her, truly seeing her, no longer just a cleaning lady, but a symbol of the human cost of my past and the human potential of my future. "Maria," I replied, a genuine smile, a rare thing touching my lips, "you have changed everything for me too." It wasn't a platitude, it was the truth. The exchange, so simple, so profound, felt like a silent, emotional handshake across the vast chasm of our former lives. The ripple effect of my decision began immediately. I convened my board of directors, unveiling my plans for a complete overhaul of Hayes Global's ethical and social investment policies. The initial reactions were, predictably, a mix of shock, skepticism, and thinly veiled contempt. Sterling, my longtime CFO, Robert Maxwell, had argued, his face flushed, "This is financial suicide. We have a fiduciary duty to our shareholders, not to social causes." But I held my ground, explaining with a conviction that even surprised myself the new vision for the company and the personal resources I was prepared to commit to ensure its implementation. It was a battle, a bruising one, fought not with market strategies, but with moral arguments, something I was unaccustomed to. I initiated the divestment from Sterling Properties' most ethically questionable holdings, including Maria's apartment building. The properties were transferred to a newly established non-profit foundation, funded by a significant portion of my personal wealth, dedicated to providing affordable, dignified housing. This act, more than any other, sent shockwaves through my empire and the financial world. News outlets picked up on the story, speculating wildly about my sanity, my health, or a potential hidden scandal. "Billionaire goes woke," one prominent business journal headline quipped. My reputation as a ruthless capitalist was being systematically dismantled, replaced by a new, more ambiguous public image. The financial cost was indeed substantial. My net worth took a hit, not enough to ruin me, but enough to register as a significant reduction in my standing among the global elite. Many of my long-term investors pulled out, fearing a shift away from pure profit-driven motives. My phone rang incessantly with calls from concerned colleagues, former friends, and opportunistic rivals. I ignored most of them. The solitude, which had once been a comfort, now felt like a necessary crucible, forging a new identity. Maria's family, meanwhile, was slowly but surely rebuilding their lives. Matteo continued his rehabilitation, now with access to the best physical therapists and specialists, his future looking brighter than ever. Carlos found steady, well-paying work, and Elena, Maria's mother, finally had a secure financial footing. Maria herself continued to work at the penthouse, a testament to her unwavering work ethic, but with a lightness in her step, a quiet joy in her eyes that had been absent before. Our daily interactions became a grounding force for me, a reminder of the tangible impact of my choices. One crisp autumn morning, I was in my study when Maria approached with her cleaning cart. She stopped just outside the door, then gently knocked. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice soft, "I brought you something." She held out a small, carefully folded piece of paper. It was a drawing, childlike in its simplicity but vibrant with color. It depicted a smiling boy holding a soccer ball with a large, smiling sun in the corner. Beneath it, scrawled in a child's hand, were the words, "Thank you, Mr. Hayes, from Matteo." I took the drawing, my fingers trembling slightly. It was a small gesture, insignificant in the grand scheme of my empire, yet it resonated more deeply than any multi-million-dollar deal ever had. It was a tangible piece of gratitude, a piece of a life I had helped to mend, and in doing so, had begun to mend my own. The cold, analytical barrier around my heart, so long impenetrable, finally fractured, and I felt a profound, overwhelming wave of emotion wash over me. It was the climax, the emotional breaking point I had unknowingly sought. My eyes welled up, and for the first time in decades I cried, not tears of sorrow, but tears of release, of catharsis, of a profound, painful, yet ultimately beautiful realization. The immense, isolating weight of my wealth lifted, replaced by a lighter, more human burden. Maria watched me, her own eyes soft with understanding. She didn't speak, didn't try to comfort me. She simply bore witness, a silent observer to the billionaire's breakdown. When I finally looked up, my eyes red and swollen, she offered me a small, gentle smile. "He is a good boy," she whispered. "He has a strong heart now." I nodded, unable to speak, clutching Matteo's drawing as if it were the most precious thing I owned. The public debate about Sterling Hayes continues. Some laud me as a visionary philanthropist, others condemn me as a misguided fool who succumbed to social pressures. My wealth, though still vast, is now actively engaged in causes far removed from mere profit. The Hayes Global Foundation, under my direct oversight, is making tangible differences in communities across the nation. My board, initially resistant, has slowly come around, seeing the long-term benefits of ethical capitalism, or at least the positive public relations. My mansion still hummed with silence, but now it felt less like a tomb and more like a mirror reflecting a man still learning to see. I often sit in my study, Matteo's drawing proudly displayed on my desk, a constant reminder of the day a cleaning lady's tears broke through my gilded cage. I am richer now, not in currency, but in consequence, in connection. The journey is far from over. There are still many battles to be fought, many lives to touch, many wrongs to right, but I am no longer alone in my fortress. What would you have done if you had heard those tears and known your empire was part of the storm? Tell me, what price would you put on a night of restless sleep, knowing you could have changed everything? The answer, for me, was everything. My empire, my pride, my carefully constructed detachment, and in return I gained something priceless, a glimpse of my own humanity.